Hello everyone. In this video I want to talk about Boon Duration and mostly DPS Boon supports, so Quickness DPS and Alacrity DPS. The examples I'm going to use are all going to be Quickness providers, but the same principles apply for Alacrity providers. Now, what you're looking at here is a Quickness Spellbreaker, which is using the banners to provide quickness. So here the tooltip says it, when you use this banner of strength you gain 7 seconds of quickness. The same is true for the banner of discipline, and the banner of tactics gives 12 seconds of quickness. So using all these banners, and we have 22 seconds of quickness. Now we have a problem, and the problem is that this boon is going to run out before we get the banners back. This means we are going to have a gap in our quickness application. The way to solve it is with extra boon duration. And here it ran out, and the goal is now to cover this gap in quickness before we can cast our banners again. Boon duration is gained through the concentration stat. So when we take a look at our gear, and we are on a power class, the stat you're trying to look out for is called Diviners. For condition classes it would be Ritualist. Concentration gives boon duration. 15 points of concentration will result in 1% of boon duration. So if you take the 121 concentration here, we are at roughly 8% boon duration. Now when we take a look at our tooltips, now it says that the quickness from this skill lasts 7.5 seconds, which is already better. And when we now cast our skills, it's still not quite enough, of course, but we are already very close and close to making it to the banner of strength cast again. We're going to take a look at how to calculate how much boon duration you actually need in a second. But let's first get back to the boon duration again. Now, it says 7.5 seconds here, but this is because the tooltip is rounding. Tooltips in Guild Wars 2 can only show durations of a quarter second, but the game is actually more exact about it. The game will try to give you quickness as accurately as the server can calculate. So even like single percentages of boon durations, even though they do not appear to change the tooltip. Let's see if it does. Yeah, it did here, but you basically what I'm trying to say is that you do not need to worry about if a change in your gear doesn't end up affecting the tooltip. It might still have an effect on how long the boon is going to last, because as I said, the duration of the boons is actually exact and does not really depend on what the tooltip tells you. They just don't want to like infinite floats precision or something. So now let's take actually a look how much boon duration we're going to need, and we see that we can cast this banner of strength for once every 30 seconds, and it also has a cast time of 3/4 of a second, and only after the cast times will it go on cooldown. So let's say the real cooldown of this thing is 31 seconds. So what we have to achieve is that these four boon skills combined will result in 31 seconds of quickness. So what we had was that the first banner of strength was providing 7 seconds of quickness baseline on a 31-second cooldown. So this is going to lead to an uptime of about 22%, and we're going to have a banner of discipline which does the same thing, 7 by 31. And finally we have a banner of tactics, which is going to do 12 seconds of quickness on a 31-second cooldown as well. And when we add these quickness sources together, we receive that we have 26 out of 31 seconds covered with quickness, and we are missing essentially 5 seconds of coverage. So we have 84% uptime. And the way to calculate how much boon duration is now needed, and please understand that boon duration is always in the sense of bonus boon duration. And we have to just calculate 1 divided by this. And then we can read off if our base boon durations of 7, 7 and 12 seconds were multiplied by this number, it would be the result would be exactly 1. So if you have 20% boon duration in our hero panel, or 19.23% boon duration in our hero panel, then our banners will be enough to cover the quickness. So if you can now go back into the game and give ourselves just 20% boon duration, some more boons. We take this one as well. This is another 2.6%. And maybe use this one as well. 21%, fair enough. If you now take a look, our boons are going to last a bit longer. And as you can see now, the quickness time is going to time out after our banner comes back up, which means we can use the banner of strength before the quickness runs out, and we basically have achieved permanent quickness. And this is how you can calculate the required boon duration. So to summarize this principle on how to do it, you have to first understand which are your boon duration skills, which are your skills like that are going to be affected by boon duration and which are giving out the boon. And then you try to work out what percentage of boon uptime they cover as baseline. So for my banners, this was now this calculation 7 seconds divided by 31 seconds, which is a cooldown, leads to 22% uptime. We do that twice, and then we have one skill that does a bit more. We add all these together, we get something smaller than 1. If it was bigger than 1, then we wouldn't need boon duration at all. Then we find out by what we need to multiply it, by just dividing 1 by this. We get the boon duration we require. Then you should round up to make it a bit safer. So, and that's the basic procedure on how to calculate how much boon duration a boon build is going to need. And that is basically how everyone does it. Now, I glossed over something that is very important, and that is the principle of cooldown reduction. Now, in group content, you're always going to have Alacrity, hopefully. So, when we take a look at these cooldowns, and actually let's just switch back to 0% boon duration to show the point. We have 0% boon duration again. We use our boon skills, and now it seems like the quickness is running out too fast, but these skills are cooling down much faster. So now a 30-second cooldown has actually become 24 seconds with Alacrity. Alacrity multiplies the cooldowns by 0.8, so 30 becomes 24. And now just before the boon runs out, we can just recast it. And actually, as you can see, 0% boon duration is enough for this Spellbreaker build if you have Alacrity. So that's basically a very important thing. And to calculate this again, let's say we have a cast time of 1 second on the banner of strength. Each of these has a cast time of 1 second. We can go back to our calculator and let's adjust this. So we have 24 seconds was the Alacrity cooldown, and then we have the cast time. So actually just 25. And let's see. So we already have a 4% overstack, and we need no Boon Duration at all. Now, this might be a bit ambitious, like to just generally assume that you're able to cast it once every 25 seconds. So one way to do it is to just now say, okay, 0% is enough, but we slap on some Boon Duration for extra safety. And like, let's have 8% of Boon Duration, which gives us a small reserve where we can basically be a bit slower. Now, this is a perfectly fine way of going about Boon Duration, and I want to show you here maybe a more mathematical option and a more deliberate option than just picking a number that is slightly bigger than what is required. As you can see, we have a slight reserve here. And we can go back to our calculator now, and instead of assuming that we get to cast it once every 25 seconds, let's assume like we are a new player on the class and maybe we forget to cast our banner once in a while. So let's say we cast it every 28 seconds. And then we divide 1 by whatever that was, and we see if we cast it once every 28 seconds, we need 7.6% Boon Duration. So, or let's go with 8% Boon Duration, and now we consider this. 8% Boon Duration to be safe enough. So we get to cast these banners once every 28 seconds. And then we're going to have permanent quickness. Now, this might still sound tight, like this is just 1 second versus 3 seconds. Like it looks still like an incredibly thin margin. But the way you need to think about this is that in a fight that is a bit longer than just one golem rotation, like just one 25-second loop, what's actually going to happen is that sometimes you are going to be faster than the 28 seconds. So sometimes you can do this loop in 25 seconds because it just perfectly aligns with your rotation and you remembered at the right moment to press these buttons. And this means that you're building a small reserve of quickness. As you can see, actually 30 seconds is the cap of quickness we can have. It is actually going to be quite difficult to build a bigger reserve of quickness. But you can see that just from having this 3 seconds difference in our loop, we assumed we cast it every 28 seconds instead of every 25 seconds. Just by having this difference in each loop, we gain at least 3 seconds of quickness uptime. And so if a phase lasts like for 1 minute, and we went through this loop 3 times, we actually have 9 seconds of extra quickness. So we're building a reserve, and that's why even a small overstack of quickness can already be extremely good for your quickness uptime comfort. Now, a criticism I see a lot written and also hear sometimes, a criticism of the websites that give you Boon DPS builds, is that the Boon durations there are way too greedy. And I understand the point behind this criticism, because on the Boon websites they would say, well, nothing is stopping you from casting the banners every 25 seconds. So, and for that we need 0 Boon duration whatsoever. So we are going to recommend a build with 0%. But What also needs to be clear is that this is a recommendation based on the realities of the player making the recommendation. And they think, as a spellbreaker, it is easy to cast these banners perfectly, so let's not cripple our damage unnecessarily by going more Boon Duration. But nothing is stopping you as a player to determine your own reality of boon application. So why don't you go to the golem, apply Alacrity to yourself, and then you can do some rotation and figure out, by looking at the log later, you can figure out what was the interval between casts of Banner of Strength. Like, did you forget about casting it sometimes because you were so busy doing some hammer rotation? Like, now I completely forgot to cast my banners for a while, and I can now go to the log and look at when exactly I cast my banners. I can then go to the calculator. If I can find it, I can then go to the calculator and say, okay, my Banner of Strength was cast once every 26 seconds, and with my Banner of Tactics, for some reason, I was way slower. And then I can find out a tailor-made duration value that I'm going to need. And you can always put in a safety margin, because you say, okay, in fights I don't have perfect alacrity, or in fights I'm going to be even more distracted than on the golem. You can even do this math based on a real boss log of yours. So you can go to Cairn and take a look at how often you ended up casting your banners, and then you can determine what boon duration am I going to need. In general, what boon duration am I going to need for Cairn, and you can use this easy calculation to basically determine what is right for you as a player. And this is what you should be doing if you are learning the classes. The boon duration values on websites they always contain a safety margin that is deemed enough, but if it's not enough for you, then just go higher. It does not detract from the guide just because it doesn't know how good you are at the game. You need to find that out for yourself and then determine the value that is right for you. Now, one thing to be careful about is I can't just go to the golem and test my boon uptime by hitting the golem and checking out how much quickness I do, because there are actually some skills like Dual Strike that just apply quickness to myself. The obvious way around it would be to bring an ally to the golem who stands here, and we can check his quickness uptime in the end. But not everyone has a friend ready at every time they want to practice their boon support build. So I think this really highlights an advantage of the math variant, where we just try to consider how often are we casting the skills and how much boon duration do we need for that. And then we can exclude the Self-Quickness skill. This is important for this build, but it's also important for something like Quickness Firebrand, which generates a lot more Self-Quickness. And it's actually as a result, many Firebrands are very bad at providing quickness because they think their own quickness is good, so everyone else is having quickness. But in reality, everyone else doesn't have quickness, and they should run more boon duration. Why are we actually so concerned with boon duration? Like, what's the point? We could just run 100% boon duration, right? And this is true for healers. Healers are going to run usually 100% boon duration, and it's their boon application is very easy. They completely overstack the boon they're supposed to apply, and they're going to be fine with it. But as a quickness DPS or a alacrity DPS, you do not quite have this luxury. Because here's the problem. Assume that you do no damage at all. then it would be actually beneficial for your squad if you didn't give quickness at all. If you ran a full DPS build that doesn't provide quickness, and your subgroup just doesn't have quickness, that's more group damage than a quickness provider that does no damage on its own. So this is very bad news for all the minstrel chrono tanks, which are not doing anything other than quickness. The same is true for Alacrity. So as a quickness DPS, you have two choices. Either you do some damage, like 10k, 15k, depends a bit on the boss and the environment, of course. Either you do some damage to separate yourself from the healers, damage-wise, or you go healer as well. Now, pickup groups will usually not run 3 or 4 healers, and it's obviously bad, but if you are a quickness DPS that is only slightly above the healers, you must think about it like this. Would it not be a DPS gain if I went full heal, still provided my boon, but also now made sure that no one can ever go downstate, and we can actually just face tank some more mechanics. We can prevent downstates, we can prevent deaths, creating much bigger damage uptime for everyone. And this is basically the pressure from below that quickness DPS and Alacrity DPS builds are facing. They need to do just enough damage to justify going damage still, and not being just a full healer, or not providing the boon in the first place. And this is why, or one reason why, we don't just recommend 100% boon duration, because if I went 100% boon duration on this build, we would actually be completely overboard with the quickness duration, and there's nothing to be gained anymore. Like, anything past, what do I have right now? Anything past 28% boon duration is already completely ridiculous duration. We are not actually benefiting from having that much, and we will just overstack and overstack. So the damage of, let's now imagine 100% boon duration in comparison, the damage is going to be much worse. We're sacrificing so many stat points to concentration. The damage is much worse, but the boon uptime is still the same. So there's like a point after which more boon duration does not help with boon uptime anymore. And now the argument can be made, it can't really be made for Spellbreaker, but for other boons classes, that maybe if you're a beginner and you're struggling more with boon application, it can be a good choice to be 100% boon duration. But even then, we have to think about our damage output. I think there's no quickness chrono player in the world who is doing a really good chronomancer rotation and struggling providing the quickness boon they're supposed to provide. Struggling to provide a boon usually, or in most cases, goes hand in hand with being very bad at the rotation. So the real course of action for a quickness chrono who is struggling with providing boons is to, number one, find out how much boon duration would be reasonable, like with the calculator thing we did before. How much boon duration would be reasonably required to maintain the boon, which is going to be like 10%, 20% or something. And then they have to practice the rotation until this is going to be comfortable and until it's going to be enough for them. Because just going higher with the boon duration in order to compensate for making very basic rotation mistakes is just going to dump their DPS, because it highlights that they struggle with the boon application, highlights that they are not comfortable on the rotation. So practicing the rotation would actually be best for them. And they don't want to just become one of these chronos who does 0 damage, because then they have to, again, wonder why they're not on a heal firebrand instead, if they could just provide healing in addition to doing no damage. So, and finally, there's another thing to consider here, why going 100% boon duration is not the solution to bad boon uptimes. Let's imagine for a second that we cast this banner once every 50 seconds instead of once every 25. And if you go to the calculator and enter that we will cast it once every 50 seconds. Okay, that's actually still enough. That's not what I wanted to show. Let's say 60 seconds. Now, there's actually, what this means is we need 130% boon duration to cover the boon. And there's not enough boon duration in the world to make up for this structural problem of us hitting the banners once every 60 seconds instead of hitting them remotely off cooldown. And here again, similar to the Chronomancer example, it would be best to practice casting the banner more often rather than just completely destroying your damage, destroying your gear. Because if you require that much boon duration, there's more things wrong with the way you play the class. And so my main takeaway that I want you to take away from this as well is that find something that works for you. Don't be ashamed if it's 27 seconds, 28 seconds. Having a small reserve builds a reserve over time when you're doing the rotation right, which you can then consume when things go wrong. So it's perfectly acceptable to run a bit more boon duration and maybe to compensate for lacking alacrity. But do not go overboard with it, because in the end, it might be better for you to practice the rotation in order to become better at boon application.